Just in case you don't know from my accent, that's where I'm from. Okay. This is for the History of Bioethics conference, and I'm writing a book called Before Bioethics, and it's about how one of the contributories to bioethics is medical ethics, and it talks about the relationship between the two. But I really want to, I use the word lumpen intelligentsia to refer to my colleagues in bioethics across the world, and I'm really, really puzzled about how people like me, I'm a philosopher by training, I started out to be a historian, I ended up being a philosopher. How did I end up talking to dying patients about their choices? And why ever would somebody who was a physician, who spent years actually let me do this, or any of us do this sort of stuff? Why would they listen to us? I have a story, if you want to hear it on the Q&A, about the real American opinion of philosophers. Now, Britons are very reasonable about philosophers. Americans are profoundly anti-intellectual, but I won't tell you the story now because we're short on time. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about Percival. He is from Manchester. He is also the person who coined the word medical ethics. And until the Second World War, for all intents and purposes, medical ethics was doctors' ethics, and this was their jurisdiction. And so this is a story about jurisdictions, how we entered into the domain, the jurisdictions of physicians. I'm going to talk about the challenges to medical ethics in both the UK and the US that arose after the Second World War. And now, the big flag says it all. Most American bioethicists pat themselves on the back or the chest or whatever they pat themselves, and they say, look how great we are, we created bioethics. But what I want to point out is that in the UK and Europe, doctors were able to respond to these challenges by consulting some lawyers, some theologians, and some philosophers without giving up jurisdiction. But in the United States, both the government and the physicians absolutely messed it up. And it was because, not because Americans were so great, but because they absolutely screwed it up, that bioethics were born. So we are the misbegotten progeny of the failed efforts of Americans to handle problems. And that's how, in the US, lumpen intelligentsia become bioethicists. And the American model, for better or worse, Heather, internationalized. And so us misbegotten people inflicted our views on the rest of the world. Here's a neat picture of Thomas Percival, the guy who coined the term medical ethics. There was no such term in English. There was a Latin equivalent, but that meant something quite different before Percival. And he defines it in the following way. It's a set of moral relations, if I can get there. I have extensive moral duties, which the physician stands to his patients, to his brethren, and to the public. For Percival and for all the early medical ethics ethicists, by the way, the relationship to the public by which they met public health was part of medical ethics. This definition arose in a book called Medical Ethics, the first book to be so titled. And it's a self-regulatory ethics of physicians and surgeons in their relationship, which, as Percival says, their peers, each other, their profession, which is slightly different, the patients and the public. And what's interesting is this arose in Britain in 1803. A similar notion, medical deontology, arises in France about 3 decades later, and these, in one form or another, in the English form or in the French form, this notion spreads throughout the Western world in the 19th century. But what I want to emphasize is this is the ethics of doctoring determining by and for doctors. It is paternalistic. It says the doctor knows best in all of these domains. And it's this paternalism that bioethics is going to challenge. Now, my colleague and friend Larry McCullough, in the current 25th anniversary issue of Bioethics, is going to challenge this reading. He's wrong. If you want to know why, ask me. Okay. Now, post-World War II ethics challenges, there are a whole bunch of them, but I want to talk about three in particular. One is morally disruptive technologies, such as Bjorn Ibsen's development of the ventilator in 1952, which led us to reconsider what was meant by death. Edwards, by the way, another Manchester native who just won a Nobel Prize, and Steptoe developed IVF in 1978, and this challenges in interesting ways notions of birth, motherhood, and so on. Resource allocation, the Scribner shunt in the United States became the key for it, but also Scribner shunt is a little piece of Teflon. It's a tube that tries a vein in an artery, if I've got it right, and what it does is allow you to do long-term dialysis, because you don't blow out veins by continually sticking needles into people. Before that, dialysis can only be for a few months, and so it creates the need for lots of dialysis machines and opens the way for massive transplantation. And both of these are going to be challenges in the American context, and also, I should add, in the British context. And of course, the scandals over human subject research revealed by Beecher in 1966 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and by Papworth in a great book called Human Guinea Pigs in 1967. Now, how did the British respond to these challenges? Well, this is all a very complicated story, but the point I want to make is they did respond, and they did respond without inventing bioethics, because they were able to handle it given the resources they already had. One of the great ingredients of their success is the NHS and other collaborative relations between the medical profession and government, which enabled them to work out these problems in a reasonable way. With respect to ventilators and brain death, the Royal Colleges issue a statement in 1976. With respect to IVF, the Warnock Commission in 1985 sets a paradigm that the whole world is going to follow. I mean, that report, chaired by a philosopher, commissioned by the government, with large participation from the medical world, sets the standards for how you're going to handle IVF throughout the world. Resource allocation, there's bedside rationing and of dialysis and transplantation within the NHS. I don't think that's quite as laudatory a story, but at any rate, it made the problem seemingly go away. And for human subjects research, after the Papworth book, the MRC develops new guidelines. These are revised, but basically, what you need to understand and get from the story is that the U.S. has no national health system, and it still doesn't have one, but it has a partial system. No NHS, no General Medical Council, no MRC, and no leverage over the conduct of researchers and physicians, except for the ability to give money. And the AMA, as we'll see, is distracted. And I'm going to give you some examples in detail of scandals arising from all these three areas: resource allocation, morally disruptive technologies, and human subjects research in the United States. And these are familiar examples, but I'll go through them, try to go through them. Okay, whoop. Okay. Now, the Scribner shunt, as I said, was this little bit of Teflon, and it makes long-term dialysis possible. That's Scribner on the right, and that's a great picture of the husband getting dialysis, the loving wife standing by, and this is a medical success. And as Scribner says, we took something 100% fatal, long-term kidney disease, chronic kidney disease, and turned it into a 90% survival rate. And this is really a medical miracle. The thing is, if you survive, you either need access to kidney dialysis or you need a transplant. Since he created a widespread demand for a limited supply of dialysis machine, there was a rationing problem. There was no standard procedure, so he used some medical criteria, and then he got together a social committee, a group of Seattle worthies, and they allocated who was going to get it and who wasn't. And when Scribner launched a public relations campaign to get more money for more machines, he invited a reporter from Look magazine, and she looked around at what was going on and decided this was a God committee, and they were using social worth criteria. If you were worthy, you had access to the machines. If you were unworthy, if you were a prostitute, as one case turned out to be, you didn't get access to the machine. And this created a scandal, and it became a national scandal. And the US Congress solved the scandal, as Americans like to do, by throwing money at it. And what they did is they said everybody can have access to this, we'll pay for everything, and that nearly bankrupted the Medicare system. So if I can get off the slide. Okay. So in other words, United States, without all the governmental collaborative professional mechanisms that it had, absolutely screwed up the challenge of resource allocation. Another familiar case is Bjorn Ibsen, first picture on the top, Pope Pius XII and Karen Ann Quinlan, picture below. Again, you have a medical miracle, halves the mortality from a polio epidemic, 1952. Again, you have a halfway technology, controls symptoms, does not cure the disease. The result is patients in persistent vegetative states. Doctors ask the Pope, turn to the Pope for guidance, Austrian doctors, and the Pope responds, you're not bound to extraordinary means. You can discontinue with consent. Sounds perfectly reasonable, except for that notion, extraordinary means. Two Catholic parents have a daughter who took Valium and alcohol. She ends up in a persistent vegetative state, and they're good Catholics. They go to their doctors and they say, look, the Pope says that if somebody's in this state, we can act in her interest, disconnect the ventilator, and the doctors say, they're good paternalists, they know what's best, they refuse to do so because they're committed to life. That goes to the courts, and you get another scandal and a widespread discussion. Deceptive research, the best example of deceptive research in the United States. And by the way, the American reaction to Nuremberg was to ignore it because it happened in Europe and, Americans. So the thing that got the attention of Americans were the research scandals of the 1960s and 1970s, the most important of which was the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. You have the white researcher who is deceptively telling people he was testing people for bad blood. In fact, and treating them for bad blood. And in fact, what he was doing is monitoring the long-term effects of syphilis. This goes on for some times. And again, 40 years untreated syphilis, and it hits the New York Times, and it's a major scandal. How did the researchers react? Well, Congress calls them in and say, what should we do? And Christian Bernard in the United States at the time said, it would be an insult to have any sort of oversight of your physicians.